After 27 years working in federal land management, first as a junior surveyor, later as a regional compliance officer, I thought I'd seen every flavor of jurisdictional mess and boundary dispute this country could throw at a man. But nothing quite prepared me for Karen. I wasn't looking for drama when I moved out to the edge of Oak Hollow Preserve. On the contrary, I was hunting peace. After decades of bureaucratic headaches, tense court depositions, and tracking illegal land encroachments through wilderness so thick you'd swear it was untouched by time, I wanted silence. Not the lonely kind, the honest kind. The kind that comes from cedar creaking in the wind, from cicadas in the evening, from the soft splash of fish breaking lake water at dawn. That's what brought me here. A 3.8-acre parcel that abutted federal wetland on one side and sat just outside the jurisdictional reach of the Ridgeway Hills Homeowners Association. It was a private sale, clean title, surveyed twice, and held in trust since 1978 by a retired park ranger who'd built a modest log cabin on the lot before retiring to Arizona. I paid in cash, had the title updated through the Federal Land Deed Transfer Program, something I knew intimately well, and moved in with nothing but my old F-150, a Labrador named Brisket, and a promise to myself: no more battles, no more boundaries. For the first 2 months, it was heaven. I spent mornings refurbishing the old dock clearing brush and watching deer come down at dusk to drink. There was no HOA mailbox on my road, no gates, no manicured lawns to match. Just gravel under my boots and sky above my roof. Even the internet barely worked, which, if you'd asked me then, was a blessing. I didn't realize how close I lived to the HOA line until a woman jogging with a leashless golden retriever paused at the edge of my drive one afternoon. She wore a neon vest, sunglasses too large for her face, and an expression like someone had just sniffed spoiled milk. "You know this isn't the community dog trail," she said without introduction. Her voice was sharp, controlled. I smiled politely and leaned on the mailbox I'd just reinstalled. Didn't think it was. "This is private land. Not under Ridgeway Hills, if that's what you mean. I'm Karen Buckley, president of the HOA. She glanced over my shoulder, eyes narrowing. "You'll need to repaint that cabin. The brown is non-compliant with Ridgeway's palette code." I let the silence breathe. "Ma'am," I finally said, "I'm not in Ridgeway." "That's not how we understand it," she replied. Brisket padded up behind me, tail wagging, tongue flopping. Karen took a reflexive step back. "That dog better be registered." And so it began. At first, I chalked it up to misunderstanding. HOA borders can be confusing. But I had maps, legal, federal, and municipal. I even pulled out the digital overlay from the county GIS to double-check. My land sat squarely outside the HOA line. My driveway wasn't connected to their roads. I had no voting rights in their meetings, no obligation to their dues, and most importantly, no liability under their CC&Rs. So I ignored her. Then came the letter, folded neatly and tucked inside a waterproof envelope taped to my newly painted fence gate. HOA stationery. Ridgeway Hills Neighborhood Compliance Notice. Violation, non-conforming dwelling exterior, unauthorized livestock structure, chicken coop, and use of visible propane tanks. I stared at it for a good 10 minutes before letting out a laugh. Brisket cocked his head like I'd lost my mind. I didn't respond. Another week passed. I found a second letter nailed to a tree. This one more aggressive citing fines that would accrue daily. That's when I knew this wasn't just a misunderstanding. Karen knew I wasn't in her HOA, and she didn't care. I'd dealt with people like her before. In my line of work, I'd seen county commissioners threaten old farmers over supposed easements, developers bribe rangers to ignore zoning violations. Even entire neighborhood groups try to vote out access roads they didn't like. But this felt personal. She wasn't acting as an administrator. She was acting like a queen with a crayon map. Still, I refused to bite. I wasn't going to be baited into battle, not yet. Instead, I sent a single certified letter. Not to her, but to the HOA board address, complete with copies of my federal land deed, the county assessor's parcel map, and a simple one-line note. Your jurisdiction ends where mine begins. Days passed, then weeks. Nothing. Until the trash started showing up. Plastic bags tossed near my fence line. One filled with chicken bones and styrofoam takeout. Another week, a torn Ridgeway newsletter duct-taped to my cabin door. Petty stuff. A kind of Cold War harassment that was so juvenile I almost admired the effort. I installed a trail cam. Then one morning, I woke up to find a neon orange cease and desist sticker on my truck windshield. Next to it, a printout of Ridgeway's covenant rules highlighted, underlined, and annotated in red pen. Someone had scrawled, "Illegal structure," next to my tool shed. Brisket barked from the porch. And me. I exhaled. Not with fear, with recognition. Because that was the moment I knew what kind of war this would be, and how to win it. I didn't respond to the sticker or the passive-aggressive red-inked violations. I'd been in federal land conflict meetings where entire forests were in question, and nobody raised their voice or resorted to graffiti on someone's windshield. But Karen didn't come from that world. She came from the world of fake authority, the kind that masks personal insecurity with procedure and polices other people to feel in control. The following Monday, I received certified mail. Not from Ridgeway's main office, but directly from the desk of Karen Buckley, with her name typed in bold beneath the HOA header, like she was trying to impersonate a judge. The envelope was thick, formal, intimidating in the way it wanted to be. I opened it slowly, standing in the driveway under the early morning light. Brisket sniffed at the base of my boot, as if even he sensed something off. Inside was a 10-page packet. Page 1, notice of violation. Page 2, a fine schedule for non-compliant, external paint color, non-permitted, agricultural structures, visible propane, storage, and the one that made me laugh, unauthorized, livestock activity, canine. Brisket apparently had been elevated to livestock. Page 3 included photos of my cabin, taken from behind some brush evidence of trespassing, and a note stating that fines would begin accruing at $100. Day per violation, if I didn't remedy the infractions or present plans of correction by the 15th. It would have been comical if it weren't so calculated. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was trying to trap me into playing by her rules. That was her mistake. I didn't call her. I didn't email. I didn't reply at all. Instead, I carefully scanned every page, annotated it for my own records, and slid it into the filing cabinet in my office beside the fireplace, just under the folder labeled Federal Land Boundary Disputes, Montana, Idaho, Ridgewater. A decade-old case I'd worked involving a similar land overreach by a local municipality. That one had ended in a $350,000 federal penalty. I'd seen how quickly lines on a map can become weapons in the wrong hands. But I also knew the law. And this time it wasn't a nameless property. This time it was my home. A week later, a white SUV rolled up my gravel path. Two women stepped out, clipboards in hand. Ridgeway's architectural review team. They introduced themselves as if that explained their presence on my land without permission. "We're just here for the preliminary compliance check," the older one said, not even asking if I consented. "No, you're not," I replied evenly. They looked confused. I pointed behind them at the painted stake embedded in the dirt beside my gate. That stake marks the boundary of Ridgeway Hills jurisdiction. Everything past that federal recognized private property. They didn't budge. "We were told this property is under HOA compliance." "By whom?" They hesitated. "Karen." Silence. I held up my phone. "Trail cams already logged your plates. If you'd like to file a formal request to inspect, I suggest you do so through a legal channel." They left murmuring, clearly unsure if they should apologize or act offended. That afternoon, I drafted a formal notice, cease and desist, unlawful access, and harassment. I cited the relevant statutes, attached my deed copy, and overnighted it to Ridgeway's management office and the city code enforcement officer. I knew they had no authority over me, but I also knew they wouldn't stop until someone made it official. Still, the next wave didn't come from Karen directly. It came from the city. 2 weeks later, I received a notice taped to my cabin door. This one wasn't from Ridgeway. It bore the City of Oak Hollow's seal and listed a request for zoning inspection based on neighbor complaints. They were trying to escalate. The inspector arrived 2 days later, a young guy named Ethan, early 30s, wide shoulders, nervous energy. He knocked politely and introduced himself with none of the fake authority Karen exuded. "Mind if I take a look around?" he asked. I invited him in, handed him coffee, and walked him through everything. I showed him the deed, the boundaries, the land classification, the utility exemptions, even the federal conservation designation from 1996 that made my property ineligible for subdivision under city code. He blinked as he read through it. This trumps HOA regulations entirely. Exactly. I didn't know federal parcels could be privately owned. Most people don't, I replied. But when I bought this land, it transferred under a clause in the Federal Homestead Reassignment Act. That makes it subject to federal land use policy, not municipal zoning boards, and definitely not HOAs. He nodded slowly, taking notes. This will probably make some people uncomfortable, especially the ones pretending they can control it. Ethan smiled a bit nervously. I'll file the report accordingly. It wasn't the end of it, but it was the first official confirmation from someone outside the HOA that I wasn't just some eccentric loner ignoring rules. I was a legal landowner protected by documentation Karen hadn't even bothered to read. Or maybe she had and simply didn't care. That's when I started hearing stories from others, from neighbors at the gas station. A woman who whispered that her child's swing set had been ordered dismantled for being non-standard. A man who'd been fined for wind chimes. A single mother whose backyard herb garden was labeled a visual nuisance. All of them had stayed silent, until now, because something was happening in Ridgeway Hills, and it was about to get worse. It was a Tuesday, warm, still, and forgettable in every way. Except one, it was the first time Karen stepped onto my land uninvited and did it not as a neighbor, but as a self-appointed enforcer. I was on my knees beside the porch, hammering in new boards along the lower fascia. Brisket lounged a few feet away, eyes half closed in the sun. The sound of tires crunching against gravel caught my attention, and I looked up to see a white Mercedes SUV inching past the cedar posts at the end of my drive, slow and deliberate, like a predator testing territory. The car stopped near the tree line. The door opened with a kind of theatrical sharpness. Out stepped Karen Buckley, her HOA badge clipped to her belt, like a sidearm phone in one hand, clipboard in the other. She wore a crisp white blouse, khaki pants creased like cardboard, and sunglasses too large for her narrow face. Behind her came a man, tall, wiry, with anxious energy and a red polo shirt tucked into belted slacks. I would later learn his name was Brian, the HOA vice president, and her loyal echo chamber. Mr. Walker, she called out as she approached, her tone honeyed but tight. We need to have a discussion. I set my hammer down and stood slowly, wiping sweat from my brow. Didn't realize Ridgeway board meetings were being held on private land now. This isn't about meetings, she replied. This is about repeated violations and your refusal to comply with community standards. I nodded toward the stake marking the edge of my parcel. You're not in your community anymore. That's where we disagree, she said, and Brian immediately nodded behind her like a bobblehead. Our plat map shows this area as part of the Ridgeway Hills overlay. I've already sent your board copies of the federal deed, Karen. I've sent them to the city. I've shown your compliance team. I even showed the inspector. She smirked, condescending. That doesn't override community guidelines. It absolutely does, I said, keeping my voice level. You're trespassing. She held up a paper. This is a final notice. If you don't begin corrective action within 72 hours, the board will move to initiate legal steps. That includes code enforcement, escalation, and civil penalties. Brian stepped forward to hand it to me. I didn't take it. You have no standing here, I said. And if you don't leave, I'll be filing a trespassing complaint with the county sheriff. This is federal recognized land, not HOA property. You don't get to redraw maps because you don't like what they say. Karen's mouth twitched. We're simply enforcing standards that maintain property value for all residents. I'm not your resident, I said, stepping closer. I didn't vote for you. I don't pay your dues. And I sure as hell don't answer to your threats. Brisket stood up then, tail low, ears forward. He sensed the shift in the air. Karen raised her phone. Are you threatening me, Mr. Walker? I'm informing you, I said. This visit is being recorded by trail cams. I suggest you walk back to your car before this becomes a legal issue far above your pay grade. She hesitated. It was just long enough for the cracks to show. The confident tone in her voice faltered. She wasn't used to someone saying no, not without flinching, not without apologizing. Brian looked at her clearly, waiting for a cue, but it didn't come. Karen dropped the notice at her feet. We'll see what the city says, she muttered. Then she turned and walked off, her heels snapping against the gravel like gunshots. They left in silence. I stood there for a moment longer, heart steady, but something underneath beginning to stir. I knew she wasn't finished. People like Karen didn't retreat when challenged. They regrouped. They sharpened their knives in the dark and came back dressed as saviors. And sure enough, within days, the whispers started. One neighbor waved at me cautiously at the mailbox. Another crossed the street instead of saying hello. A third pretended not to see me at all. The HOA newsletter suddenly included a vague section about non-compliant properties affecting neighborhood safety. A rumor floated up from the bakery downtown that someone was building a gun range on Ridgeway's edge. Another rumor said my dog had bitten a child. None of it was true, but that wasn't the point. Karen wasn't trying to beat me in court. She was trying to isolate me before she ever got there. I knew the strategy. I'd watched bureaucrats do it for years, reframe a dispute as a danger, make the target the other use soft fear instead of a hard law. It worked in HOAs because most people just wanted to mow their lawn and be left alone. By the end of the month, I received another notice. Not from Karen. From the city! It cited multiple community complaints and announced that a hearing would be held regarding zoning conflicts and potentially unpermitted structures. Attached was a grainy photo of my shed, another of the small solar panel array I'd installed near the waterline. The same photos I'd seen in Karen's original packet, clearly passed along without my consent. I sat at my desk that evening, the notice open, beside my whiskey glass. Brisket lay at my feet, chin resting on my boot. Outside wind pushed through the trees. A storm was rolling in. Karen had drawn her line, but I had a line too, and mine was made of documents with seals and signatures that trumped everything she thought she controlled. The next day, I scheduled an appointment with the city clerk. It was time to bring my file. I didn't sleep much that night. Not because I was afraid I'd face down armed poachers and out-of-control fire marshals in backwoods hearings that made Karen look like a Girl Scout with a clipboard, but because I knew exactly how far she'd go. The HOA world, as petty as it seemed on the surface, had claws. And Karen, she knew how to sharpen them on good people's backs. The day after I met with the city clerk, I dropped off copies of my federal deed, original land plat, and zoning exemptions at the municipal office in person. The young man behind the counter blinked as he looked at my documents. You're saying your parcel isn't zoned under Oak Hollow jurisdiction. It's registered under federal conservation land with a reassignment deed from 1998, I said. I'm exempt. I filed the initial transfer back when I was still a regional officer. He whistled low and nodded. No wonder they're upset. You're a ghost in their system. Not a ghost, I corrected him. Just someone they can't bully. By Friday, Karen must have gotten wind that I'd gone to the city because that weekend things took a darker turn. It started with the fence. Saturday morning, I woke to Brisket barking like mad at the eastern edge of the property. When I followed him out with a flashlight, I found 3 of my cedar posts torn out. Not kicked, dug, yanked. Like someone had pried them out with a crowbar under cover of night. No tracks, no witnesses, just silence. I documented everything. Took photos. Uploaded the timestamps to my backup drive, and made a police report not because I thought they'd do much, but because I needed a trail. Sunday, my solar batteries were unplugged. It took me half a day to figure out why the lights wouldn't charge. Someone had snuck into the battery housing and flipped the breakers, then relocked the panel with a different screw pattern. Tampering plain and simple. By Monday morning, I found a bright yellow flyer pinned to my doorframe. Are you safe living near this man? Below it, a pixelated photo of me unloading lumber from my truck. Under that bulleted claims, Ng has refused compliance with HOA rules. Possesses firearms and large animals. Has threatened HOA members and resists city inspection. The worst part, there was no signature, just concerned Ridgeway residents. That evening, a woman I didn't recognize parked at the bottom of my drive and took pictures of my cabin. I walked down to confront her, but she drove off before I reached the gate. I noted her plates, another report filed. Then came the phone calls. Restricted numbers ringing just once. Voicemails with static, then one that hissed. You should have just painted the house. That one made my spine stiffen because it meant they weren't just playing with code and fines anymore. They were trying to unnerve me, gaslight me. I'd seen this before, how power structures preserve themselves by making the lone resistor look irrational. But they didn't know who I was. I wasn't the man who rolled over when the wheels of faux authority came knocking. I was the man who documented, measured, and struck back only when the record was airtight and the blade was legal. So I stopped reacting emotionally. I went cold. I organized everything. Every notice, every flyer, every printed rumor. I started a folder labeled Ridgeway Interference and filled it with screenshots, video clips from my trail cams, dates, and times of every incident. Then, I drove an hour north to meet with a former colleague now working as a compliance attorney for the Bureau of Land Management. Her name was Dana Wells. Tough, sharp, and not easily rattled. When I laid out my evidence, she exhaled slowly and said, "They're trying to drag you into their system by making you look dangerous. If they can frame this as a community safety issue, they'll call in the county. They want you painted as unstable so they can claim cause." "Can they?" I asked. "Not without lying," she said. "But if they lie and you catch them, it's federal obstruction and potentially harassment under Section 242. Enough to go to court. Enough to flip the whole HOA on its back." She helped me write a preliminary letter, a formal warning to the HOA citing overreach, harassment, and unlawful trespass. We mailed it certified with return receipt, addressed not only to Karen, but also to the property management company that oversaw Ridgeway's legal operations. Then I waited. And while I waited, I worked. I upgraded the cameras, installed motion lights, built a second shed, and made sure it sat precisely within the setback lines. Everything by the book. Everything documented. Every inch of land reinforced with the kind of paper trail that made bureaucrats shiver. Brisket stayed closer those days. I started sleeping with my trail cam feed open on a tablet beside the bed. I knew it sounded paranoid, but I also knew it wasn't. Paranoia is a belief without evidence. What I had was evidence. The response came 2 weeks later. A manila envelope slid under my gate at night. No postage. No return address. Inside a printed copy of my land deed. And one sentence scribbled in red marker across the top. "This changes nothing." That's when I knew Karen had read it. She knew she had no legal ground. And she didn't care. Because this wasn't about law anymore. It was about control. And she was about to lose it. The sun was barely cresting over the pine trees when the flashing lights showed up at the edge of my gravel drive. I was sipping my first coffee of the morning, standing on the porch with Brisket at my feet. It had been a long night. Trail cam caught another figure sneaking along the eastern border around midnight, but they'd disappeared before I could intercept. I figured it was just more scare tactics. I didn't expect 2 police cruisers and an unmarked SUV to pull up like I was running a meth lab in the woods. Brisket stood up immediately, growling low. I didn't move at first. I watched as the officers got out 2 uniformed city cops, one younger visibly tense, his hand grazing his belt as if expecting a confrontation. The other older wore mirrored sunglasses and walked with the calm of someone who'd been on the job too long to be rattled by HOA politics. From the SUV came a third figure. Karen. She stepped out with a tight smile on her face, lips pursed, as if she were about to announce something smug at a town hall meeting. She had a manila folder in one hand and a cell phone in the other, already recording. I placed my mug down gently and walked out toward the gate. "Morning, officers," I said calmly. "Are you Jackson Walker?" the older cop asked, glancing down at his notepad. "I am." "We received a call from the Ridgeway Hills HOA, alleging that you are unlawfully occupying land within their jurisdiction," the younger one chimed in. "They've also raised concerns about non-permitted structures and potential firearms violations." I raised my eyebrows. That's a serious allegation. Karen stepped closer to the edge of the driveway, holding her phone up like she was filming a sting operation. "We have video and multiple complaints," she said, trying to sound composed, but failing to hide the excitement in her voice. "You've refused inspections. You've built illegal structures. You've threatened residents. We're finally holding you accountable." The officers shifted their weight. I could see it in their posture. They weren't sure what they were walking into. That's how she'd planned it. Make the target look hostile enough, confusing enough, and hope law enforcement sides with the entity that talks like it has authority. I exhaled slowly and nodded. "Give me a moment." I turned back toward the cabin, Brisket close behind me. I didn't run. I didn't rush. I moved deliberately, opened my lockbox, and retrieved the black folder with the raised federal seal on the front. I'd kept it ready for weeks. When I returned to the gate, I handed it to the senior officer. "Inside, you'll find a full federal deed, the original parcel plat jurisdictional overlays from the county assessor, a letter from the Bureau of Land Management, and a notarized letter confirming that my land is not and has never been under Ridgeway Hills HOA jurisdiction." He opened it and began to read. Karen's face started to shift. The younger cop glanced over his partner's shoulder. After a few moments, he cleared his throat. This seems pretty definitive. The senior officer nodded slowly, then looked at Karen. Ma'am, have you reviewed this documentation before contacting us? Karen's lips tightened. Those documents are outdated. The HOA updated our boundaries through community vote. I couldn't help it. I let out a quiet, incredulous laugh. Karen, you don't get to change legal property boundaries through a vote. This isn't a PTA bake sale. The younger cop gave a short cough to hide a chuckle. The older officer turned toward Karen again. Do you have any documentation that overrides this deed? Her voice faltered. We've sent multiple notices. He's refused to comply. He's hostile. That's not what we're asking, the senior cop said. Do you have legal documentation that shows this land is under Ridgeway Hills jurisdiction? Karen hesitated. For the first time, I saw her stumble. Her eyes flicked from my face to the folder, then back to the officers. No, she finally said. But then this is a civil matter, the officer said firmly. And based on the documentation Mr. Walker has provided, I'd say you're trespassing. Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He handed the folder back to me. Mr. Walker, you're within your rights to ask Ms. Buckley to leave your property. I nodded calmly. Karen, I'm asking you to leave. And if you or anyone from your board sets foot on my land again without a warrant or an official government order, I will press charges. Her face was white now. Whatever theater she'd planned had turned into a silent reckoning. The phone in her hand was still recording, but it hung lower now like a prop she forgot she was holding. You'll regret this, she muttered. The older cop raised an eyebrow. That sounded a lot like a threat. No, she snapped. It was a prediction. She turned on her heel and marched back to the SUV. The two officers gave me a small nod, then walked away without another word. As the convoy drove off, I stood there in the middle of my drive, heart. Steady pulse, low. Brisket sitting beside me like a sentinel. The silence returned. But it was different now. Thicker, heavier. That had been her play. Call the cops. Make a scene. Hope I'd lose my temper or flinch under pressure. Instead, she'd shown her hand and folded. But if I knew Karen and I was starting to, this wasn't the end. It was just the moment she realized she'd picked a fight with the wrong man. The next morning was unnervingly still. No joggers cutting across my property line. No cars idling near the mailbox. Not even a passive-aggressive flyer fluttering from a bush. Brisket and I walked the perimeter before sunrise, and for once, there was nothing out of place. Not a footprint. Not a fingerprint. That kind of quiet only meant one thing in a war like this: someone was regrouping. I didn't wait. By mid-morning, I had made half a dozen copies of my federal deed packet, each neatly bound and labeled. I dropped one at the city clerk's office, one at the county assessor's department, and another at the sheriff's substation. I wasn't trying to provoke anyone. I just wanted a paper trail so thick, so unambiguous that no future officer code, enforcer, or pencil pusher could claim they were unaware of my rights. I wasn't hiding. I was standing still while they circled, hoping I'd move first. And then 2 days later, the knock came. Not aggressive, not rushed. Just 3 firm taps on the front door that rattled through the wood like cold fingers. I opened it to find a man in a city badge jacket, Robert Hall, the new community development liaison for Oak Hollow. Young, well-dressed, and clearly uncomfortable. Behind him on the edge of my property line near the public road stood a woman I recognized immediately, Karen. Arms folded, sunglasses perched, face clenched in that smug I-win expression she wore like armor. Robert cleared his throat. Mr. Walker. Good morning. May I speak with you? I nodded. Sure. You want to come inside or stay where your shoes won't violate federal land? He blinked. Out here is fine. I stepped out and shut the door gently behind me. He pulled a manila envelope from under his arm and handed it over. There's been a formal review of the complaints filed by the Ridgeway Hills HOA. They claim you're in violation of several community safety codes, including improper utility access and non-conforming structures. I've filed my deed with the city. We've seen it, he said quickly, then added with a glance toward Karen. But due process requires that we investigate all claims, so I'm here to verify the boundaries for myself. I said nothing, just nodded toward the trail stake I'd painted bright red for days like this. Robert walked over to the edge, then pulled out a laminated parcel map. As he examined the overlays and compared them to the visible markers, his posture changed. He didn't say a word for a minute. Then he flipped the map over and found the back where I had already highlighted the disputed borders in blue and annotated the coordinates. "You did this?" he asked. "Former job," I said simply. He sighed. "Your property is clearly outside Ridgeway jurisdiction." Karen stepped forward from the road like a pouncing cat. "That doesn't mean he's exempt from city codes. He built a shed. He has propane tanks visible. There's nothing on this parcel that violates city code." Robert cut her off louder than necessary. He hadn't even turned to look at her. His eyes stayed on me. "Mr. Walker, would you be willing to walk me through the deed paperwork again, just for official clarity?" I nodded and disappeared into the cabin for a moment, returning with the black folder and handing it to him. As he flipped through the pages, the original federal reassignment form, the land plat with agency stamps, the exemption letter signed by the Department of Interior. His expression turned from wary to reverent. "I've never seen a deed like this," he murmured. "I spent 15 years auditing them," I replied. He closed the folder, held it against his chest, and looked toward Karen. "This land is not only outside Ridgeway Hills jurisdiction, it's protected under a federal land transfer program. You can't zone it, fine it, or regulate it with HOA standards." Karen's mouth opened, but no sound came out. Robert added, "And given the boundary confirmation and the documentation he's provided, I would advise the Ridgeway Board to cease all complaints or risk legal consequences for harassment and misrepresentation." I've never seen someone's skin go from pink to gray so fast. Her shoulders tensed. She glanced around as if searching for a rebuttal in the trees. "You can't let him get away with this," she hissed, the mask finally slipping. "He's undermining everything we've built. If one lot doesn't follow the rules, none of them will." "That's not how law works, Ms. Buckley," Robert said. Still polite, still steady. "And Ridgeway Hills doesn't own the land. The federal government does. Mr. Walker is the current title holder of record. This isn't a debate." Karen's lips trembled. She took a step back, then two, clutching her clipboard like it was a shield. For a moment, she looked like she might scream. Instead, she turned and stormed off toward her car. As she opened the door, I called after her. "You want to police your neighborhood, Karen," I said. "Start by respecting its borders." She didn't answer. She slammed the door so hard the window shook and drove off without another word. Robert turned to me with a tired smile. "You handled that well." I shook his hand. "I've dealt with worse in timber hearings out west." He nodded toward the folder. "Mind if I make a copy of this for city records?" "Make 3, I said, "and send one to the Ridgeway Board while you're at it." He laughed, then added, "I think this might trigger some audits." I smiled, slow and deliberate. "I'm counting on it." By the end of that week, the wind had shifted, and not just through the trees. The atmosphere in Ridgeway Hills had taken on a strange new flavor. Where once there were sharp glances and whispered assumptions, there was now quiet. Hesitation. I'd catch glimpses of neighbors slowing their cars as they passed my property, not with the bold suspicion they once carried, but with something else behind their eyes. Curiosity. Caution. Karen had overplayed her hand, and the bluff had collapsed in full view of the only people she needed to impress, her residents. The moment Robert Hall, a city official, had publicly declared my land outside their grasp, it was like someone had snipped the invisible thread that bound her authority to perception. I could feel it, and I wasn't the only one. 3 days after that confrontation, I received a knock on my door, not from the police, not from HOA drones, but from a woman in her 60s, with a kind face and garden gloves still tucked into her belt. Her name was Marla, a Ridgeway resident for 9 years. She introduced herself shyly, her voice low. "I'm sorry for how they treated you," she said. "A lot of us didn't know." Karen, she doesn't tell the truth. I invited her up onto the porch. Brisket leaned against her leg like he'd known her forever. Marla told me about the time her grandson's tricycle had been cited for clutter, about how her late husband once got fined for building a handmade bench under the oak tree in their front yard. She told me about the newsletters, how they shamed homeowners into silence, how complaints were weaponized behind closed doors, and how speaking up meant getting watched. But most of all, she told me this: people thought you were dangerous. That's what she told us. But you were the only one who ever stood up to her and didn't flinch. I nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling in. I'd seen regimes topple from smaller sparks. The next morning, 2 more visitors showed up. A young couple, Darren and Sophia, newly moved in, disillusioned already. They'd received a warning for having a welcome mat that clashed with Ridgeway's earth tone policy. You think you could help us? Darren asked. Maybe help us understand what we can do. I didn't hesitate. Start with your bylaws. Know what they can actually enforce. Then get your neighbors talking. Over the next week, a quiet momentum began to build. People started reaching out, not in groups, not loudly, but individually, in quiet conversations. A man at the hardware store slipped me a thumb drive filled with PDFs, internal HOA communications he'd received when volunteering for their newsletter a year ago. It included early drafts of complaint forms, including one with my address on it, dated before I even moved in. That made things clear. Karen had targeted my property before she even met me. She hadn't been reacting. She had been planning. That weekend, I drove out to visit Donna Wells again, my contact at the Bureau of Land Management, and now a close confidant in this battle. I showed her the thumb drive, the dates, the patterns. She reviewed them all carefully, her lips pressed into a thin line. This might be enough, she said. Enough to make a formal claim of coordinated harassment, even if I'm not a member of their HOA. Especially because you're not, she said. It shows they extended their reach beyond their legal jurisdiction. That opens them up to liability. They can't hide behind the HOA charter to dodge. We drafted a complaint detailing the timeline, the escalation, the false calls to law enforcement, and the manufactured rumors. We submitted it not just to the city, but also to the State HOA Oversight Committee and the County Civil Compliance Board. Then we waited. But the waiting didn't mean inactivity. Inside Ridgeway Hills, the tremors were growing. At first, they were whispers someone had seen Karen in a shouting match with her vice president. Someone else mentioned the board was meeting more often than usual behind locked doors. Then came the leak. One of the HOA board members, an older man named Dennis, whom I'd never spoken to, sent me a copy of an internal memo from Karen. In it, she blamed the Walker incident for growing unrest and urged the board to reassert visible authority before non-compliance spreads. It was the kind of thing that might have flown under the radar if not for what happened next. Karen made a mistake. She issued a fine to a family over Christmas lights, a $250 penalty, to a family whose child had cancer. They'd strung up a line of white lights in October to make the boy smile. They'd done it quietly, lovingly, hoping no one would notice. Karen noticed, and she punished them. But this time, the story didn't stay quiet. The family spoke to the local paper. Then a radio station picked it up. Within 48 hours, there was a segment on the evening news. HOA Grinch fines family over lights for sick child. I didn't even need to say anything. The community turned on her. Residents started showing up at the Ridgeway Clubhouse, demanding transparency, demanding new elections, demanding proof of authority. One woman stood outside the building with a handmade sign that read, "We are not your subjects." And right there in the middle of it, quietly, calmly, I handed out printed packets of my federal land deed. Not to gloat, to teach, to remind people you have rights too. The tide had turned. Karen wasn't the enforcer anymore. She was the exposed nerve in a community waking from sedation. And I was just getting started. It was the last Friday of the month when I received the envelope. Unlike the others, this one wasn't official looking. No HOA letterhead. No city seal. Just a plain manila pouch slipped through the slats of my gate at dawn. Brisket sniffed it like it was a snake. I opened it cautiously, half expecting another veiled threat or fabricated violation. Inside were copies, dozens of them. Internal Ridgeway emails, screenshots, meeting notes, and at the top, a sticky note in cramped, shaky handwriting. "You were right. She's dangerous. I'm done protecting her. Deesh." Dennis, the same board member who'd leaked the memo weeks earlier. Now it looked like he was done whispering and ready to shout. I spread the documents out across my kitchen table. Brisket circled once and curled up beneath me as I scanned through each page. There were email threads between Karen and other board members discussing strategies for increased compliance pressure. A euphemism, if I'd ever seen one. One document revealed Karen had pushed the board to reallocate HOA funds, nearly $11,000, to hire a community relations consultant who, as it turned out, was her niece. No experience, no deliverables, just invoices. But the worst one, a forwarded email from Karen to Brian, her ever-loyal vice president. Onto subject. Walker situation. Body. "He's not just a thorn, he's a threat. If the city won't act, maybe someone needs to make this unpleasant for him." People like that break when they feel watched. It chilled me. This wasn't just about boundaries or bylaws anymore. This was about silencing me. I forwarded the whole batch to Dana, my attorney friend, and called her directly. Her voice was tight with anger. This is more than harassment. This is targeted retaliation. With those emails, we can prove malice and intent. That same afternoon, Dana helped me file a formal federal complaint, citing abuse of authority by a private governing entity against a non-member landowner. We attached every scrap of evidence we had and submitted it not only to the county civil board, but also to the state attorney general's office and the Department of Housing and Community Development. And then we went one step further. We filed a motion to initiate an injunction against Ridgeway Hills HOA, preventing them from taking any further actions against me or my property pending the outcome of an investigation. We served it directly to their board at the next HOA meeting. I didn't go alone. Dozens of Ridgeway residents showed up with me. Marla was there, standing proud, with her gardening gloves in her back pocket. Darren and Sophia, the family with the Christmas lights. Even Dennis standing in the back corner with his arms crossed like a man finally breathing free. When Karen saw the motion documents being handed to her by a sheriff deputy, she tried to laugh. "Is this supposed to scare me?" she asked, loud enough for the room to hear. I stood up calm and clear. "No, it's supposed to stop you, and soon it might bury you." She turned red, not pink, not flustered, but furious. Her voice cracked as she pointed at me. "You have poisoned this neighborhood. You're the outsider here, not us. We built this place. We protect it." Marla stood. "You protect yourself," she said firmly, "and you punish anyone who won't play along." Another voice chimed in, then another. And just like that, the illusion broke. The meeting turned from a monologue into an uprising. Residents demanded financial disclosures. They wanted records of every fine issued, every complaint filed, every dollar spent. They shouted over the board's stammering excuses. And when Brian tried to restore order, someone yelled from the back, "We want a vote." It was chaos, but righteous chaos. The next day, I received a visit from a local reporter. Word of the complaint, the injunction, the internal corruption had spread like wildfire. He wanted an interview. I agreed on one condition: I wouldn't smear anyone personally. I'd speak only in facts. The article that came out on Sunday morning carried the headline, "Federal Deed, Local Fury, How One Man Exposed a Rogue HOA." And below that, a photo of me and Brisket standing at the stake marker that defined the edge of Ridgeway's reach. Karen didn't speak publicly for a while after that, but she wasn't done. 1 week later, someone broke into my shed. They didn't take anything, they just smashed it. Tools flung, wiring cut, the walls spray painted with a single word: intruder. I didn't flinch. I had cameras, and they got everything. The blurry figure, the car, the plate. It wasn't Karen, it was Brian. He was arrested 2 days later for trespassing and vandalism. And while the HOA scrambled to distance themselves, the residents weren't buying it. At the next board meeting, they voted by a 2/3 majority to suspend Karen, initiate a full financial audit, and request independent mediation. By then, it didn't matter what she tried to salvage. The truth had settled in like a deep root. Her reign was over, and the system that had protected her was unraveling faster than she could patch it together. It had been just under 3 months since Karen first showed up on my property, clipboard in hand, certain she was the queen of everything the light touched. And now, standing on the edge of Ridgeway Hills Park with over 40 neighbors gathered around a fold-out table, I could barely recognize the place. Children played near the swings, a group of retired folks handed out lemonade, and the whispers that once followed me like a shadow had turned into casual waves and nods. This wasn't the Ridgeway I'd moved next to, it was something new, something alive. It started with the audit. After Brian's arrest and the release of the injunction, Ridgeway residents demanded transparency. And when the HOA reluctantly agreed to a third-party financial audit, nobody expected what would spill out. Over $60,000 in unexplained expenditures, payments to vendors that didn't exist, community improvement invoices signed by Karen herself for landscaping that had never happened. One of the worst fines, HOA dues, being funneled into a slush fund labeled President's Discretionary Budget. When questioned, Karen claimed it was used for emergency board needs. But there were no receipts, no breakdowns, nothing. And when pressed further, she simply stopped answering. Marla, who had joined the newly formed oversight subcommittee, called me the day the report dropped. "She's finished," she said. People who defended her are now asking for refunds. And that's when something amazing happened. People started knocking on each other's doors, not to report, but to talk, to connect, to understand how things had gotten so twisted without anyone realizing it. It wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a neighborhood waking up from sedation and seeing the iron bars they'd been told were flower trellises. I was invited to speak at a community roundtable hosted not by the HOA, but by the residents themselves. I didn't prepare a speech. I just showed up with brisket and a folder full of documents. I expected hostility or skepticism. What I got instead was applause. Not for fighting, but for staying. For standing calmly in the face of intimidation and showing others they could do the same. Darren and Sophia led a petition to put new bylaws to a vote. Ones that would limit the power of the HOA president, require quarterly financial transparency, and most importantly, include a clause that explicitly prohibited the HOA from asserting authority beyond its legal boundaries. The petition gained over 100 signatures in a week. Karen, who hadn't been seen in public since the audit report, submitted a resignation letter through an attorney. No apology, no statement, just silence. And in her place, the board held an emergency vote. Dennis, the quiet man, who once worked in shadows, was elected interim president. His first action, to acknowledge on behalf of the board that Ridgeway Hills Homeowners Association deeply regrets its unlawful actions toward Mr. Jackson Walker. We recognize his legal rights and extend a formal apology for the hardship caused. They printed it in the newsletter, in bold, front page. That night, I sat on my porch with a glass of bourbon, the sunset bleeding pink across the horizon, and brisket snoring gently beside me. It wasn't about victory. It was about dignity. Not just mine, but the dignity of every person who had been made to feel small, silenced, or afraid in their own home. And as word spread beyond our neighborhood, something else began to happen. Emails started trickling in from strangers, veterans, retirees, single parents, teachers, people across the state who had their own HOA horror stories. Some had been fined into foreclosure. Others threatened for things as small as painting a door the wrong shade of blue. I saw your story in the paper, one wrote. It gave me hope. Another, I've been scared to speak up for years. Thank you for reminding me I'm not crazy. And then a third from a man named Richard in a neighboring county. We're organizing now. We want to rewrite our HOA bylaws too. Could you help us understand how you did it? I stared at that one for a long time because I hadn't realized it until that moment. This wasn't just about Ridgeway Hills anymore. This was about all of them. About the people across the country trapped under the thumb of power run, wild power. Without oversight, power used to control instead of serve. So I called Dana, and we started something. A working group, a resource center, a series of free workshops for communities navigating abusive HOAs. We called it Homeowners with Rights. And what we started, small online guides, templates for petitions, a hotline for legal referrals. But it grew, because the truth always does when you stop whispering it. And as Ridgeway Hills rebuilt itself from the ground up, one neighbor, one voice, one truth at a time, I realized something I hadn't dared to before. This land wasn't just mine because a deed said so. It was mine because I'd stood for it. And in doing that, I helped others stand too. Spring came early that year. The kind of spring that doesn't ask for attention, just unfolds quietly. A warmer breeze, softer sunlight, the smell of damp earth rising through pine. And for the first time since I'd moved into my cabin on the edge of Ridgeway Hills, the quiet wasn't laced with tension. It was genuine. Earned. The HOA was no longer what it once was. Under Dennis's interim leadership, a full reorganization was underway. Karen's resignation, though bitter and unapologetic, had opened a door that everyone, even her staunchest allies, had secretly longed to walk through. People weren't afraid anymore. They were curious, engaged. When the new bylaw revisions passed with a landslide 88% vote, I was invited formally this time to attend the ratification meeting, not as a spectacle, not as a warning, but as a neighbor. I sat in the back, same chair I'd once been stared down from. But this time, it was different. Residents smiled as they filed in. A teenage girl I didn't know handed Brisket a treat. Even Brian, recently returned from court-mandated mediation and stripped of all voting rights, gave me a curt nod of acknowledgement. When Dennis read aloud the clause, affirming boundary recognition and explicitly limiting the HOA's jurisdiction, the room applauded. And I didn't clap for myself. I clapped for them. They'd done the hard part. They'd woken up. After the meeting, I stepped outside and found Marla sitting on a bench under a jacaranda tree, sunlight dappling her weathered hands. She looked up and smiled. "We never expected it to happen this way," she said. "No," I replied, "but maybe it needed to." She tilted her head. "Are you staying?" That question had crossed my mind more than once. I'd come here for silence, solitude, a place to lay down the weight of decades working inside a system that too often protected the wrong people. But what I'd found here wasn't silence. It was a voice. Not just mine, but a whole community's. "I think I will," I said quietly. And stay I did. Weeks passed, then months. The advisory group Dana and I started gained traction. We spoke at a small-town summit on HOA reform. I was invited to a county zoning panel to share my story. I wasn't trying to build a brand, but the story, our story, had a heartbeat of its own now. One evening, I found a folded note left in my mailbox. No stamp, just a single page torn from a legal pad. It read, "Thank you for not backing down. My parents live here. I was too scared to speak before. You helped us all find our courage." No signature. I kept it pinned above my desk. A reminder that sometimes just standing firm is more powerful than shouting. Ridgeway Hills slowly transformed. Where fear once dictated interactions, conversations bloomed. Gardens that had been dug up under Karen's regime were replanted. A community bulletin board replaced the anonymous complaint drop box at the clubhouse. And in a move that felt almost poetic, the HOA voted to rename their quarterly newsletter. It was now called True Common Ground. One bright Saturday morning, I hosted a neighborhood gathering on my land. Yes, my federal land. I smoked brisket, brewed sweet tea, and strung up lights between the trees. It wasn't a protest. It wasn't a statement. It was just a meal, a gathering. Children ran along the creek. Dogs played. Dennis gave a short speech thanking everyone for choosing community over control. And at one point, I caught Sophia holding her newborn daughter beneath the cedar tree I'd once had to defend with legal codes. I realized then that healing isn't always grand. Sometimes it's found in the smallest things. The shared bread, the absence of suspicion, the way people look at you when they're no longer afraid. As the sun set and the last of the guests trickled home, I sat back on the porch with brisket beside me. Our legs tired, our hearts full. This land hadn't changed, but the people on it had, and so had I. I was no longer the man who came here to disappear. I was the man who stayed, who stood, who reminded a neighborhood what boundaries were really for, not to divide, but to protect. Not to control, but to give each of us space to breathe, grow, and live without fear. This wasn't just a victory. It was a beginning, and I'd take that over silence any day.